So React recently has added in context. So this is a fairly newer paradigm in terms of how you can pass state into your React components. Very recently, people have been using Redux to pass down state from a central store into your components, but now you could use React context, which is React's way of passing state down into different components without actually having to pass them into props. And so we'll show how this works now in our app. So we're going to be building our app to use context. So basically, I'm just going to scroll through these examples just to kind of explain some of these to you. In general, it's very simple how this works, but you might be confused by some of these docs. So the thing we're going to be doing is creating a context, and the context is created through react.createContext. And you could think of this as a component, but the way you access component is by choosing either a provider or a consumer. Provider is what you would wrap your components in, which allow you to pass state into them. So you need the provider, and then in here, this value, you're going to choose our React state. So this is where we would put our React state when we're creating our React components. And then all consumers will re-render when the provider's value changes. So if we're in a React component, we change the state, this provider will then notify the consumers that we have a state update. And so to kind of show an example of a consumer, so here's a consumer. Let's say we are one of these buttons, for example. We can wrap those buttons in a consumer wrapper from our main context, and then we gain access to this function which has the current value of our state. And so you could do this anywhere in your app as long as you import this context. And that's basically it. So those two elements that you need to create. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's create our app provider now. So we're going to create something called app provider. And the way to think about this is it's just the state manager of the app. It's not going to render anything, except it is going to render our children, but it's actually not going to be styling anything or doing anything. It's just sort of the state container you could think of this as. First, we're going to import React. Then we're just going to export a provider. So we're going to say app class.provider. And I'm just naming this provider. It's not a React thing. That's just the name of the class I'm giving this. We're going to specify a constructor, and we're going to say super, and then we're just going to set the state equal to the dashboard. So we're going to set this page equal to the dashboard. That's just going to be our initial state that we're going to be running with for this example. It's pretty much all we need for the constructor. Now let's actually create a function that's going to set the page on this app. So we're just going to call this set page. And this is going to be a simple function that just says this.setState with the page. And you could see here, this is just a function that I'm defining. It's passing in a page that you can pass in, and then it's going to say React, this.setState. This is the React's way of setting the state. And then here, this was going to destructure to page:page. And so that's the set page function. And I believe that's all we're going to do here for now. It's very simple. And then also now the render. So the render is, well, actually, let's create that context first. And so now let's actually export the context. So we're going to say export app context equals react.createContext. So what this is going to do, it's going to create a new React context for us, and then we're going to export this to actually use the consumers in the child components. And then the provider is going to be exported in our main wrapper to provide this state with the other components. So now finally, we just need to create a render function. Let's create that render right now. So we're going to say render, and we're going to return this app context dot provider. And just like the example, we're going to say value equals this dot state. We're going to wrap this, and then we're going to close this off. And then inside of here, we're just going to say this dot props dot children. And so what this is going to do, it's just going to pass through our children into here, and then that way they will get access to this provider. So this is the whole provider that we have to start with now. And now we're just going to save this and then head on over to our app index where we will pull in this provider. So let's go ahead and do that. Just simply wrap this here, app provider from app provider, and then just wrap this here. We don't need this in our layout, so we're just going to wrap it in our child components. And then we can space these out so you could see that these will now be wrapped with that provider. And we didn't specify a default export, which means we didn't write the word default in our export class expression. And so To wrap this in brackets, that just means pull that name from that file. So the default was just going to come out as a regular name, but to wrap that in brackets, you're pulling it out of the object export. Now we can use this context that we've defined here in our child. So let's go to our child, which we're going to go to the app bar. And then now in our control button here, we can just pull in that. So we're going to import that context first. So import app context from the app provider. And then we can wrap our control button in the app context.consumer. And that consumer will take in a callback. So let's just first finish wrapping this. And then now just like that, we can pull in that page state variable from that state. So we actually need to wrap this here in brackets. So it's a little bit hairy in terms of the bracketing here, but basically we're pulling the page from the state. This object is pulling that state, or the state's being pulled from that object there. And then this is the callback, and parentheses, and then we'll determine the active from whether the page is equal to the name that we pass in. Let's just save that, see if that works. Okay, so it didn't like this, so that's because I didn't close off this callback here, or the bracket. All right, so I close this off, and then you could see now we actually are pulling in that page from the provider. So now let's just double check that this works by changing this to settings. And now you could see that our app is actually functioning correctly. So that's just an intro to app provider. Next, we'll go and actually implement a click handler on the button right now. So let's just go ahead and do that. So go back to our app bar, and we can now pass in our click handler here. So we're going to say set page. And then when we click on this control button element, let's just space this out a little bit. When we click on this, we say on click, we're going to pass in a Lambda function to set the name of the state to be the name. So the one thing we didn't do yet is actually we have to define this, we have to store this inside of the state. So I know this sounds weird, but this is how they recommend to do it. So going back to the React docs for a second, so you can see right here, they do pass in that function into the state. So it's kind of odd that we're passing functions into the state, but so you can see here, they also mention that. So the state contains the updater function. We pass in our updater function into the state. So we're just going to say set page, this.setPage. We save that. And now let's go back to our app bar just to verify. Okay, so we have this, and then now we click, and now we are setting the state on that parent component. That's context in a nutshell. We're going to be using this throughout the rest of our app. And I believe that is going to be it for the app bar. So we're just going to commit this now. So we're going to say git add, git commit, add app provider, and hook up to app bar.